Under the twilight glow, a new fate begins. Kazama walked along the familiar road home, his backpack slung heavily over one shoulder, weighed down by textbooks. He had traveled this path hundreds of times, past the old gas station with its flickering neon sign, past the diner where the waitresses used to call him cute little guy whenever he visited with his grandmother, and onto the stretch of road where the streetlights were too far apart, leaving scattered patches of darkness. But tonight, something felt different. A sharp metallic sound rang out, a piercing clash, followed by a small explosion, then a crunching noise, like something heavy collapsing. Kazama stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding as he turned toward the incline ahead. As he stepped forward, the scene before him made his breath catch in his throat. A car lay overturned, its roof crushed against a roadside tree, shattered glass sparkling like fallen diamonds under the dim light. Smoke billowed from the engine, curling into the air like a monster awakening. For a moment, panic gripped Kazama, and his instincts screamed at him to run, to find help. But then he heard it, a faint moan, barely audible over the sizzling sounds of the burning engine. Kazama dropped his backpack and sprinted forward. Through the cracked windshield, he could see someone trapped inside, a girl, no older than a few years above him. Arya, he guessed. Her head lolled to the side, a deep gash across her forehead, trailing blood down her cheek. Her eyes were half open, lips moving slightly, but too weak to form words. "Hey, can you hear me?" Kazama shouted, pounding on the window. No clear response. He ran to the other side, gripping the mangled frame of the car, trying to wrench the door open. He pulled hard. It wouldn't budge. He stepped back, bracing himself against the ground, yanking again with all his strength. The door didn't move an inch. No time to hesitate. Kazama spotted a loose metal rod under the car and grabbed it, swinging it against the windshield. Once, twice. On the third strike, the glass shattered. Ignoring the sting of tiny shards slicing into his skin, he reached inside, fumbling for Arya's arm. "I'm getting you out. You have to help me." His voice was urgent, a faint whimper. She was still conscious. Kazama gritted his teeth, pulling her forward. Her body shifted but remained wedged under the steering wheel. He repositioned himself, gripping the fabric of her jacket, summoning every ounce of strength he had. With one final heave, Arya broke free, collapsing into Kazama's arms. But just as he caught her, a deafening roar erupted from the engine. Flames surged forward, devouring the wreckage. No time to think. Clutching Arya tightly, Kazama ran. He sprinted down the darkened road, his footsteps echoing against the silence of the night. 10 steps, 20 steps, then, boom, the car exploded. A shockwave slammed into Kazama's back, throwing him forward. The world spun, the sounds around him muffled by the ringing in his ears. Heat seared his skin. When he finally opened his eyes, Arya was still breathing. In the distance, the wail of sirens cut through the night, flashing lights breaking through the darkness. Kazama gasped for air, his gaze locked onto the inferno consuming the wreckage. He had saved her, but even as relief washed over him, a strange feeling settled in his chest, a sense that this was far from over. This was only the beginning. The morning after. When Kazama knew everything had changed. The sky the next morning was just as blue as always, but to Kazama, everything felt different. He sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly chewing on a piece of cold toast, his legs swinging under the chair. Across from him, Grandma Bertie, who had raised him since he was little, flipped through a stack of bills, her eyes squinting behind her reading glasses. "Are you eating that toast or just keeping it for decoration?" she asked, not looking up. Kazama took another slow bite, mumbling, "I'm eating." She let out a small huff, but didn't press further. Kazama wasn't usually this quiet, but this morning he didn't feel like talking to anyone. The image of Arya, the girl he had pulled from the wreckage last night, kept flashing in his mind. The blood on her face, the faint whimper of her voice, the warmth of her limp body as he dragged her out of the car. It all replayed like a scene stuck on loop. Grandma Bertie stood up, stuffing her wallet into her purse. "I gotta get to work. Take your sister to school, and don't let me hear about you getting into trouble with those street kids again. You hear me?" Kazama nodded. He always nodded. 10 minutes later, he was walking down the street with his little sister, Tiana. At 12 years old, she probably had more attitude than anyone he'd ever met. And as usual, she was stomping a few steps ahead of him, annoyed that she had to walk with her older brother. "Don't make me late today," she grumbled, shoving a notebook into her backpack. Kazama didn't respond. Southside buzzed like it did every morning. The honking of cars, kids laughing, music drifting from someone's open window. He knew every face, every shortcut, every alley to avoid. But today, none of it mattered. He kept thinking about Arya. Was she okay? Did she remember what had happened? Did she wonder who had saved her? At school, everything was as normal as if the world hadn't shifted last night. Teachers talked about fractions. The kid next to him doodled in his textbook, and the old air conditioner rattled like it was about to break down. During lunch, Kazama met up with his best friend, Terrell, near the basketball court. "What's up with you?" Terrell asked between bites of his sandwich. Kazama hesitated, staring at the ground. "Nothing." "You never do nothing." Kazama kicked at a loose rock. "Ever done something but you weren't sure if you should talk about it?" Terrell squinted. "You get in trouble?" "No." Kazama took a deep breath, then shook his head. "Forget it." Terrell shrugged. "Your call." But Kazama couldn't forget. That night, after finishing his homework, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The old fan above spun lazily, casting long shadows against the walls. Kazama barely noticed. He kept thinking about the burning car, the red glow of the ambulance lights, the way Arya's trembling hand had reached for him when he pulled her free. And somewhere, maybe far away, maybe closer than he thought, Arya was waking up too, in a brightly lit hospital room, with questions that had no answers yet. The search for Kazama, Arya's determination. The sky outside Arya's hospital window was a perfect shade of blue, but inside her mind, everything was still a haze. She had woken up to a blinding white light, the rhythmic beeping of machines ringing in her ears. It took a moment to realize she was in a hospital, wires and tubes attached to her body. Her throat was dry, her limbs sore, as if she had been hit by a freight train. The door creaked open, and her mother, Mrs. Caldwell, stepped in. Her face was lined with worry, but when she saw Arya's eyes open, she nearly broke into tears. "My love, do you know where you are?" Her voice trembled, but there was unmistakable relief in it. Arya blinked, her own voice weak, as if each word required all her energy. "Hospital?" Her mother nodded rapidly, exhaling deeply. "Thank God." The doctor said, "You have a concussion, a fractured rib. But you're alive, sweetheart. Do you know how close you were to—" Arya didn't need the reminder. The memory of the rain, the slippery road, the helplessness as the car lost control, all of it came crashing back, squeezing her chest with a cold grip. Just then, the door opened again, and Jan Caldwell, her father, walked in. He had always been a composed man, his expensive suits crisp, his demeanor sharp like he had just stepped out of a high-stakes meeting. But today, even though he maintained his usual calm, there was something in his eyes Arya couldn't quite read. She swallowed hard, then asked, "Who saved me?" A heavy silence followed. Her mother glanced at her father before turning back to Arya. "A boy, a kid. We don't know his name yet, but the paramedics said if it weren't for him, you wouldn't have made it. A boy? Fragments of memory flickered through her mind. A distant voice calling out, hands small but firm, pulling her from the wreckage. That face. She couldn't picture it clearly. I want to meet him, Arya said. We need to find out who he is. Jan sighed, stepping closer to the bed. Arya, you need to focus on your recovery first. Her mother, however, was not so easily swayed. No, I agree with her. We need to find that boy. We owe him everything. The word owe made Jan hesitate. This doesn't need to be blown out of proportion, he said, his voice low and measured. Blown out of proportion? Arya's eyebrows furrowed. Someone risked their life to save me. I can't just pretend that never happened. Her mother folded her arms, her gaze sharp. Charles, that boy saved our daughter. The least we can do is say, thank you. The room grew tense. Moments later, a nurse entered, her voice calm but firm. The paramedics reported that the boy left before they could get his name. Silence thickened the air, but in that moment, Arya knew one thing. She wouldn't let this boy disappear into the shadows. She would find Kazama, no matter what it took. Kazama and Arya. A meeting of fate. Kazama sat in Mrs. Caldwell's luxurious SUV, his fingers lightly gripping the edge of the seat. The leather was soft, almost velvety, unlike anything he had ever sat on before. Even the scent inside the car was different, a refined fragrance he couldn't quite name, not the cheap air fresheners or the faint mint of gum he was used to. Mrs. Caldwell sat in the front, her phone constantly vibrating in her hands. He watched as she swiftly typed out messages, her face distant as if her mind was elsewhere. The car moved through unfamiliar streets. Towering buildings lined both sides of the road, their glass facades reflecting the city lights. Gone were the narrow alleys, the peeling walls, and the cracked sidewalks Kazama had walked all his life. Finally, the SUV pulled up in front of the hospital. Mrs. Caldwell turned to him, her sharp eyes scanning his face once more. "Are you ready?" she asked. Kazama swallowed, unsure what exactly he was preparing for. But he nodded. The door opened, and as he stepped out, he could feel the stares of people around him. It wasn't every day they saw a kid like him stepping out of a luxury vehicle like this. The hospital's long, sterile hallway stretched before them, filled with the faint scent of disinfectant. Mrs. Caldwell led him to a room on the top floor. The door swung open, and there sat Arya, her hair slightly disheveled, her face still pale. Her eyes widened the moment she saw him. "It's you," she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. Kazama felt a little awkward. He never thought of himself as special, nor did he expect anyone to remember him. But in Arya's eyes, he could see that she did. She tilted her head slightly. "Do you remember me?" Kazama scratched the back of his head, feeling a little uneasy. "Not much, but you do." Arya blinked. "They told me what you did. If it weren't for you, Kazama cut her off with a shrug. "I just did what I could." Silence settled over the room, not an uncomfortable one, but a moment of quiet where everything could sink in. The unspoken words passed naturally between them, a silent understanding. Mrs. Caldwell stood in the corner, watching but saying nothing. Finally, Arya smiled softly. "Thank you." Kazama rubbed his nose. "Yeah, no problem." And in that moment, he realized maybe he had done something more important than he ever thought. Kazama steps into the spotlight, a life that will never be the same. Kazama stepped out of the hospital, descending from the Caldwell family's gleaming SUV. He didn't look around, didn't care about the curious stares from passers-by. The conversation in Arya's hospital room still lingered in his mind. For the first time, someone truly appreciated what he had done. but he also knew not everyone would feel the same. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his old, battered phone. 3 missed calls from Grandma Bertie. He knew she didn't like waiting. Taking a deep breath, Kazama turned his back on the lavish hospital and walked back toward his world. But the moment he stepped onto the street, he knew something was wrong. Bright camera flashes exploded in front of him, the sharp clicks of shutters echoing in his ears. A swarm of reporters blocked his path, microphones shoved toward his face. "Kid, are you the one who saved Aria Caldwell? How does it feel to be a hero? Has the Caldwell family offered you anything yet?" Kazama instinctively stepped back, but there was no way out. The reporters had already closed in, their voices overlapping, pressing in on him from every direction. He had no idea what to do. He had never stood in front of a camera, never been the center of attention. The relentless barrage of questions made his heart pound. "Walk away." A familiar, steady voice cut through the chaos. Kazama turned and saw Grandma Bertie standing in front of a small grocery store, arms crossed. Her face was unreadable, but he knew she wasn't pleased. Without hesitation, he lowered his head and pushed through the crowd, sprinting toward the store. The moment the door shut behind him, everything fell silent. Grandma Bertie looked him over, her sharp eyes scanning him. "What did you do?" Kazama frowned. "I didn't do anything." She pulled the kitchen towel off her shoulder and tossed it onto the counter. "Then why are there a dozen reporters outside? You think they just happened to find you?" Kazama clenched his fists. "I don't know who told them, but I do." Grandma Bertie leaned on the counter, eyes piercing. "This has been in the Caldwell family's hands from the start. And trust me, they don't want this story getting out." Kazama knew she was right. He had seen the look in Jan Caldwell's eyes at the hospital. That wasn't the look of gratitude. It was the look of control. "So, what do I do?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Grandma Bertie sighed, pouring herself a cup of coffee before sliding a cookie toward him. "You have to decide. What do you want from this?" Kazama stared at the cookie but didn't take a bite. He didn't know what he wanted. He had never thought about being thanked or rewarded. He had just done what he could, but one thing was clear. He didn't want to be used. Just then, the door opened again. But this time, it wasn't a reporter. Aria stepped inside, alone. Kazama looked up, surprised. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady. Grandma Bertie glanced between them before taking a slow sip of her coffee. "I'll be in the back. Keep it quiet." Kazama met Aria's gaze, and for the first time, he realized his life might never be the same after that night. Azuma stands at a crossroad. An offer. He can't ignore. Kazama stood outside Bertie's store, the unease in his chest still lingering. Aria, the girl he had saved, had shown up alone. No bodyguards, no parents. That wasn't normal. He glanced at Grandma Bertie, but she simply shrugged, lifted her coffee, and disappeared inside, leaving him alone to face Aria. She stepped closer, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, her blue eyes glimmering under the streetlights. She didn't look like what he imagined a rich girl would be. No arrogance, no distance, just curiosity, like she was searching for something. "Can we talk?" Her voice was soft but firm. Kazama crossed his arms. "You didn't come all this way just to ask that, did you?" Aria let out a small smirk. I want to know why you turned down everything my father offered you." Kazama frowned. "I don't need anything from your family." "Don't need it? Or don't want to take it?" The question made him pause. He had spent his life facing things alone. Rejecting help wasn't because he didn't need it. It was because he knew the cost of accepting it. Aria sighed, stepping even closer. "My father isn't the kind of man who likes being in debt. If he can't repay what he owes, he'll find a way to control the situation to his advantage. Kazama smirked. So, that's why he wants to keep this quiet? She nodded. The press can't find out that Jan Caldwell's daughter was saved by a nobody from Southside. It doesn't fit the image he wants to project. Kazama let out a dry chuckle. So, did you come here to tell me to disappear? No, Arya shook her head. I came here because I want to help you. Kazama raised an eyebrow. Help me? Why? Arya hesitated, then said, Because I owe you, but not just that. I think you deserve a better chance. He studied her, trying to decide if this was another trick from the Caldwell family. But she looked sincere. She wasn't like her father. What do you mean? She pulled a small envelope from her bag and handed it to him. A scholarship, a full ride to my school. I asked my mom to help arrange it. Kazama stared at the envelope in his hands. Inside were official documents, confirming that everything had been taken care of. This wasn't a check like her father had offered. This was an opportunity. And if I say no? He asked. Arya gave him a knowing smile. Then I'll find another way to help you, but I really hope you don't. Kazama tightened his grip on the envelope. He had never thought about his future like this, never imagined leaving Southside. But maybe this time he should. Kazama at the crossroads, a future. He never considered. Kazama sat quietly on the stoop outside Bertie's store, his gaze fixed on the familiar streets of Southside. The scholarship Arya had given him was still tucked into his jacket pocket, yet it felt heavier than he expected. He had spent the entire night thinking. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was an escape. But accepting it also meant stepping into a world where he had never belonged. The night breeze grew colder, carrying the familiar sounds of Southside, the laughter of kids playing on the sidewalks, the distant honking of cars, and the muffled music drifting from someone's apartment. He had grown up here, in a place where no one expected anything from him, where nothing was given without a price. But Arya, she wasn't like her father. How long are you going to sit there? Bertie's voice cut through his thoughts. Kazama looked up, seeing her leaning against the door frame, her sharp eyes watching him. He sighed. I don't know. This feels weird. Bertie crossed her arms, studying him as if she were sizing him up. You can say no if you want, but don't turn it down just because you're scared. Kazama let out a dry chuckle. I'm not scared. I just don't know if I belong there. Bertie stepped down and sat beside him on the stoop. Listen, Kazama, you've spent your whole life surviving in a world that never gave you any favors. But that doesn't mean you don't deserve this. He stayed silent, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. She continued, You think Arya gave you this just out of gratitude? Number, she sees something in you, something worth investing in. But the real question is, do you see it in yourself? Kazama didn't answer right away. He looked out at the streets where he had grown up, where dreams rarely made it past the surface before being crushed. But now, for the first time, another road had opened before him. He took a deep breath, then nodded. I'll try. Bertie smiled, patting his shoulder. Good. But remember, you're not proving anything to anyone but yourself. Kazama clenched the envelope in his hands. He had no idea what the future held, but this time he wasn't going to back down. Kazama's choice, a future. Beyond Southside, Kazama walked through the streets of Southside, the glow of the streetlights stretching his shadow along the cracked pavement. Arya's scholarship offer rested in his jacket pocket, but his mind was still racing. For the first time in his life, someone believed he could be more, that he deserved a chance. But did he really belong in that world? When he reached Bertie's store, the lights inside were still on. She stood behind the counter, flipping through the ledger. She didn't say anything when he walked in, just waited for him to speak. Kazama dropped onto an old wooden stool near the counter, staring at the worn tiles on the floor. "What do you think I should do?" Bertie set the ledger down and crossed her arms. "What do you want to do?" He let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I never thought I'd get a chance like this. But if I go, everything changes. I'm not sure I can fit into their world." Bertie raised an eyebrow. "Their world? You really think there's such a clear line?" Kazama shrugged. "You know it's not that simple." She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Kazama, you don't have to define yourself by where you come from or what you've been through. If you want this opportunity, take it. But don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve it." He was quiet, turning her words over in his mind. "You can change your life, Kazama. The only question is, are you ready to?" Kazama clenched his fists. He had never imagined a future outside of this neighborhood, but now it was right in front of him. He took a deep breath and stood up. "I'll try." Bertie smiled, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "Then go make it worth it." Kazama stepped out of the store, the night air cooler than before. He didn't know what the future held, but this time he wouldn't let fear stand in his way. Kazama's crossroads, a step into the unknown. Kazama walked along the cracked sidewalk, his worn-out sneakers scraping against the rough concrete. The dim streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across Southside's familiar streets. In his hand, he still held the scholarship letter Aria had given him. It was weightless, yet it felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. He stopped in front of Bertie's shop. The warm glow from inside spilled through the glass windows, illuminating the night with a quiet familiarity. Inside, Bertie was going through her books, just like she did every evening. But when Kazama stepped through the door, she didn't question him right away. She simply looked up and waited for him to speak. Kazama dropped onto a chair near the counter, his fingers running along the edge of the folded paper. He took a deep breath. "What do you think I should do?" Bertie set her ledger down, her gaze steady and non-judgmental. "The real question is, what do you want to do, Kazama?" He let out a dry chuckle, one without humor. "I don't know. I never thought I'd get a chance like this." He clenched the paper a little tighter. "I never thought I belonged in that world." Bertie studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Have you ever asked yourself why you think that?" Kazama met her eyes, unsure how to respond. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. "Is it because you truly believe you can't do it? Or because you've been told for so long that kids like you don't get opportunities like this?" He inhaled deeply. He couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had heard it too many times. Kids from Southside didn't make it out. He had seen too many people try, only to be pulled back in. "But if I go," Kazama started, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I leave here, do I stop being me?" Bertie smiled softly. "Kazama, you don't define yourself by where you come from. You define yourself by how you choose to live. If you go, you're not changing who you are. You're just giving yourself a new path." He sat there, thinking. Something about what she said made him feel lighter, but at the same time, it terrified him. "So what should I do?" he asked. Bertie folded her arms, leaning forward slightly. "You've got two choices, Kazama. One, you let fear keep you here. Two, you take the step forward even if you don't know what's ahead." He let out a small chuckle, his eyes finally showing a spark of something new. "You always make things sound so simple." "Because it is simple, Kazama. The only thing holding you back is you." He looked at the paper again. It wasn't just an acceptance letter. It wasn't just a way into a prestigious school. It was an opportunity, a chance to change, to step out of the shadow he had always thought he was stuck in. Kazama stood up, slipping the letter into his pocket. "I'll try." Birdie nodded, her expression firm but kind. "Then go, Kazama, and make it count." As he stepped out of the shop, the cool night air brushed against his face. The street remained the same, flickering lights, the distant hum of Southside's familiar sounds. But for the first time in his life, Kazama felt like he could leave this place without losing himself. He took a deep breath, then walked forward toward a future he had never dared to dream of. Kazama's choice. Stepping into the unknown, Kazama stood in front of Birdie's store, his mind tangled in thought. The check from Arya's family sat untouched on the counter inside, but the scholarship letter remained tucked safely in his jacket pocket. He didn't want their money but an opportunity like this. He had never imagined it would be his to take. Inside the shop, Birdie was rearranging jars of spices on the shelf, but when she saw Kazama, she stopped, crossing her arms as she studied him. "You've got that look again, kid." Kazama sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting down at the counter. "Do you think I should go?" Birdie didn't answer immediately. She poured herself a cup of tea, took a slow sip, and then finally spoke. "The question isn't whether you should go, Kazama. The real question is, what are you afraid of if you do?" He fell silent. Birdie continued. "You can't live your whole life afraid of what you don't know. That's not who you are." Kazama let out a small, humorless laugh, his gaze still distant. "I just don't want to change. If I leave, will I still be me?" Birdie set her teacup down, her eyes filled with understanding. "Kazama, you're not defined by where you come from or where you go. You're defined by the choices you make. And right now, your choice is whether to stand still or move forward." He stared at his hands on the counter. "I feel like if I step out of here, I'll be stepping into a world that doesn't belong to me." Birdie chuckled softly. "Then make that world yours." Kazama frowned slightly. She went on. "You think the people in that world never had to fight for their place? Everyone starts somewhere, Kazama. They might have had a head start, but that doesn't mean you can't find your own way." Kazama exhaled deeply. "I don't want to do this just because Arya feels guilty or because her family wants to turn me into a story they can tell." Birdie nodded. "Then don't do it for them. Do it for you." Those words made him pause. Do it for himself. For the first time, he realized that this wasn't just a way out of Southside. This was a chance to prove to himself that he could be more than the limits the world had placed on him. He stood up, taking a steady breath. "You're right," Birdie smirked, her eyes twinkling. "Of course I am. I always am." Kazama let out a quiet chuckle before walking toward the door, stepping back into the familiar streets. But this time, something inside him had shifted. The next morning, when he arrived at school, Arya was already waiting. As soon as she saw him, she hurried over, hope flickering in her eyes. "Did you think about my offer?" Kazama held her gaze for a long moment before pulling the scholarship letter from his pocket. He didn't say a word. He just handed it to her. Arya glanced down at the paper, and when she looked back up, something bright shone in her eyes. "So, you're going?" Kazama nodded, a smile spread across her face, not one of pity or obligation, but something genuine. "Good, because you deserve it." For the first time, Kazama started to believe that might actually be true. He wasn't going just because someone had opened the door for him. He was going because he wanted to prove that he could step through it and carve out a path of his own. The meaning of Kazama's journey. Kazama's story isn't just about courage, it's about choice. He saved someone's life without expecting anything in return. Yet that one act changed his own fate in ways he never anticipated. In life, good deeds aren't always immediately rewarded, and sometimes even sincere help comes wrapped in layers of expectation, judgment, and challenge. But the most important thing is how we respond to opportunities, whether we run from them or embrace them. Kazama refused to let circumstance or fear define his future. He chose to step forward, not to prove anything to the world, but to prove to himself that he could be more. His journey reminds us that change is never easy, but when we have the courage to face it, we can break past the barriers that society or our past tries to impose. Because in the end, we aren't just shaped by where we come from, we are shaped by where we choose to go. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.